Meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, dear colleagues, and most notably, dear Peter Gordon, let me welcome you all to the 2019 Adorno Lectures on behalf of the Institute for Social Research. I'm Theodor, currently the Institute's interim director. It is my pleasure and my great honor to announce Peter Gordon as this year's Adorno lecturer. He is MLB James Professor of History and faculty affiliate at the Department of Philosophy at Harvard University. We are all very grateful to Peter Gordon for having accepted our invitation to deliver this year's lectures that take place in the year of the 50th anniversary of the death of Theodor Adorno. The event of the Adorno lectures is such that our institute organizes in cooperation with the Surkamp Publishing House is already going into its 17th year with today's lecture. The Institute for Social Research has started this lecture series in the year 2002 with a meanwhile well-known lecture by Judith Butler. In those lectures she indicated for the first time what later was to be called the ethical turn of her approach. Further lectures followed in annual intervals. They were given by Eva Illus, Franklin Skinner, Stephen Greenblatt, Luc Boltanski, José Brunner, Robert Pepin, Michel Lamont, Didier Bassin, and Daniel Allen, to name but those from outside Germany. All these illustrious list of names reveals that the purpose of our lecture series is not primarily to present studies on Adorno's work, not to increase the vast exegesis of his writings, but to examine what progress can be achieved in his spirit within the various disciplines to which Adorno's work has been devoted. What we want to achieve by this lecture series is to help closing the growing gap between the still lively reception of Adorno's writings and their limited effect on current trends in the human sciences. Therefore, we usually do not invite specialists of Adorno's works, but leading representatives of different disciplines to present their actual research so that eventually Adorno's still inspiring legacy becomes visible in one way or another. However, this year's lectures are an exception, at least to some extent. On the occasion of the 50th anniversary of Adorno's death, on August the 6th in 1969, the lectures are dedicated to an explicit examination of his work. Nonetheless, I'm quite sure that Peter Gordon's lectures will somehow draw Adorno into our present time. Now I'm soon going to hand over to Axel Honneth, who was the director of the Institute for Social Research for almost 20 years until December 2018, and who is now a member of our so-called Stiftungsrat. I'm very happy that you, Axel, are able to be here, not only, but also because it was you who invited Peter Gordon to give this year's Adorno lectures. And these lectures have a very promising title, Theodor Adorno and the Sources of Normativity. Before the stage is yours, Axel, I would like to thank our two sponsoring institutions that make this annual lecture series possible by their financial support, namely the Dezernat für Kultur und Wissenschaft der Stadt Frankfurt and the Hessische Ministerium für Wissenschaft und Kunst. On behalf of the Institute for Social Research, I would also like to express my gratitude to Eva Wilmer, who is here from Surkamp Publishing House, for her continuous support of the Adorno lectures, and to Adorno, not Adorno, but Sonja Becker, for her indispensable help in preparing and organizing these lectures. Now it's your turn. Excellent. Thanks for being with us.
I fear you have to wait another 10 minutes before Peter will start to talk, because to give even a brief overview on his intellectual development takes some time. So, you, Peter. Thank you. It was an easy matter for us at the Institute for Social Research to decide, I think 2 years ago, whom to invite to deliver this year's Adorno lectures, the year to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Adorno's death. Among the many international scholars working on Adorno's legacy today, Peter Gordon is without question one of the most conspicuous and illuminating ones. Having studied over years the history of social thought and philosophy in Germany and France in the late modern era, he since some time now concentrates on the multifaceted interdisciplinary work of Adorno, trying to understand his underlying rigor and its constitutive motives. But not only this, the hermeneutical endeavor to apprehend Adorno even better than he himself might have been able to, is it what makes Peter's engagement with Adorno's work special. What adds to this more scholarly preoccupation is a courageous and timely attempt to demonstrate the actuality of Adorno's thinking, be it in analyzing the Trump era by using Adorno's social psychological insights into the mechanisms of authoritarianism, be it in appropriating his subverting and dialectical deciphering of the religious tradition, or be it simply in making sense of modern operas or modern music, as we just heard, which is not really modern. But before getting caught in the trap to characterize Peter Gordon exclusively as an Adorno scholar, let me briefly present you his intellectual trajectory so that you can easily see how broad the scope and how penetrating the perspective of his studies on the intellectual history of our late modern era, in fact, are. Born in Seattle, Peter attended for a short period the University of Chicago before receiving his Bachelor of Arts degree from Reed College in Oregon. He continued his studies under the guidance of Martin Jay, the first historian of the Frankfurt School, at the University of California in Berkeley, for which he received his PhD in the year 1997. His dissertation that dealt with the complicated relation between the Jewish thinker Franz Rosenzweig and Martin Heidegger is already a clear indication of the themes Peter Gordon would be interested in the next years, in the years to come. From 1998 to 2000, he is working as a member of the Society of Fellows in the Liberal Arts at Princeton University, where he is mainly busy with preparing his dissertation for publication. The book appears in the year 2003 under the title Rosenzweig and Heidegger, Between Judaism and German Philosophy at University of California Press. Cutting across the artificial divide that the traumatic memory of National Socialism has drawn between German and Jewish philosophy, this book seeks to restore Rosenzweig's thought to the German philosophical horizon in which it first took shape. It is the first English language study to explore Rosenzweig's enduring debt to Hegel's philosophy, neo-Kantianism, and philosophy of life, and provides additionally a new systematic reading of Rosenzweig's major work, Der Stern der Erlösung, a book hard to understand in its systematic ambitions, as everyone will certainly know who ever tried to read it. Peter joined the faculty at Harvard University in the autumn of 2000, where he became a member of the Department of History, this must have been the time when he started to take the first steps in the direction of his new project, a study supposed to investigate the historical circumstances and the systematic meaning of the well-known split within continental philosophy between Heideggerian existentialism and Cassiras neo-Kantianism. It would take Peter almost 8 years to finish this project by a book, but the result was definitely worthwhile all the efforts invested in it. You can find the book, by the way, outside in the table of the bookshop. In 2010, the book appeared under the title Continental Divide, Heidegger, Cassirer, Davos at Harvard University Press. It immediately became a huge success, awarded with prestigious prizes and honored by a great number of symposia and reviews. In his description and analysis of the Davos encounter between Heidegger and Cassirer, Peter's primary concern is to show that the politicization of the debate obscures our appreciation for the substantive questions at issue. He objects to fixing political historical consequences to the debate on grounds that were only later supplied by Heidegger's public declaration of support for Hitler and Cassirer's quiet resignation of his chair in Hamburg. In over-politicizing the debate, or so the thesis runs, one misses the genuine significance of the philosopher's substantial disagreement about Kant. To repair the damage done to the intellectual history, Peter details the differences among the schools of neo-Kantian philosophy in early 20th century Germany, carefully marking out distinctions between Marburg and Freiburg, Kohn and Husserl, and shows how these evolved before, during and after the encounter of Cassirer and Heidegger at Davos. By doing this in a masterful, carefully elaborated and wonderfully written way, the study has become a milestone in the intellectual history of the fate of Kantianism just until the rediscovery of Kant's work in the aftermath of the Second World War and the Holocaust. In 2005, 5 years before publishing this book, Peter was appointed to a position on the permanent faculty at Harvard University. He is currently the Emeril B. James Professor of History with faculty affiliations at the Center for European Studies, the Department of Germanic Languages and Literatures, and the Department of Philosophy. All this indicating the more than purely historical significance of Peter's contribution to the intellectual path of late modern thought in France and Germany. It is a period shortly after having been appointed to full professorship that Peter began to concentrate more intensively on the intellectual legacy of the Frankfurt School, especially the philosophical work of Adorno. The first result of this new stage in his intellectual development was a book entitled Adorno and Existence, also to buy on this table outside, published in 2016 by Harvard University Press again. Peter here pursues with great skill and brilliancy a perceptive intuition, that one can learn more about Adorno's thought by examining what this thinker was against than what he was in favor of. The opposed body of thought at issue in this book is existentialism, especially in Søren Kierkegaard, Edmund Husserl, and Martin Heidegger. Peter, in a detailed and fair-minded way, leads the reader through Adorno's various, usually quite vigorous attacks on both transcendental and existential phenomenology from 1930 on. He rightly notes that Adorno returned to this critique throughout his life as if he were bound in some way to what he opposed, unable to be done with a philosophy he clearly considered both inadequate and dangerously naive. Sometimes Peter seems even to suggest that this finding of Adorno seems motivated by a defensive fear that his own philosophy might itself be infected by existentialism's deepest wish, the wish for a way of living out and understanding the unconceptualizable fact of human existence. It is exactly this detection of the deep ambivalence of Adorno towards existentialism that makes Peter Gordon's Adorno and Existence one of the most valuable contributions to the still growing bulk of literature on Adorno in recent times. Besides writing all these path-breaking books, just shortly summarized, Peter, since being full professor at Harvard, also became editor of numerous collections, all worthwhile to be mentioned because of their relevance for the intellectual history of late modernity. In 2007, he edited a Cambridge Companion to Modern Jewish Philosophy. Together with Warren Gretman, he edited in 2008 the Modernist Imaginations, Essays in Intellectual History and Critical Theory, a Festschrift in honor of Martin Jay. And in 2018, to mention one more of these many carefully selected collections, he edited together with Espen Hammer and myself the Routledge Companion to the Frankfurt School, which was the occasion that brought me the pleasure to make his personal acquaintance, a person full of charm, knowledge, and illuminating ideas. This short overview on the intellectual development of Peter would not be complete if I did not note at the end the two last projects of him. As I alluded to already earlier, he always also had an interest in demonstrating the actuality of Adorno's thinking, trying to understand the strong support for Trump by certain groups of the white population in the United States was an occasion to give proof of this. Together with Wendy Brown and Max Pensky, he published in 2018 a small volume with the title Authoritarianism, 3 Inquiries in Critical Theory, to which he contributed a fascinating article that explores how to use Adorno's concept of authoritarianism as an instrument to analyze the massive support for the terrifying government of Trump. Finally, to end with the current project of Peter, it doesn't come as a surprise after all what we have heard, to be informed that he is now working on a book that is supposed to reconstruct the idea of secularization within social theory since Max Weber. A book that, given the quality and penetrating power of his earlier works, can be expected to be a major contribution to the ongoing debate on the fate of religion in our times. This was it. Now it's your
Thank you very much, Axel, for that very kind introduction. And my thanks to everyone who made this visit possible. It's a great honor to speak here. It's an honor I fear I may not deserve, despite the introduction we just heard. I'm aware of the special nature of this occasion, and of course the distinguished nature of the Adorno-Vorlesungen. And I'll try to do my best to speak in a way appropriate to the occasion. Can you hear me at the back? Am I okay? Okay-ish? Okay. I'll just speak louder. How's that?
Yes.
Okay. Right. Well, the philosopher and social theorist Theodor Adorno died 50 years ago in the late summer of 1969. By contemporary standards, his life was not long. He did not survive to see his 65th birthday. But during the time that was given to him, his achievements were astonishing. He enriched and transformed not only the canon of modern European philosophy, he also contributed to debates in empirical sociology, literary and cultural criticism, and musicology, and he left behind no less than 3 collected volumes of musical compositions. It should not surprise us that Jürgen Habermas, who had been his close student and assistant at the Institute for Social Research, was not embarrassed to call Adorno, quote, the only genius I've ever met. The young Teddy, as he was known among family and friends, was delicate in physique and often the object of ridicule at school. But he could rely on the loving attention of his parents, who nourished his gifts and sought to assure that the prodigy would emerge from the chrysalis. His father, Oskar Wiesengrund, an assimilated German Jew, worked as a wine exporter, and as a boy, Teddy would play with his friends among the bottles stored in the cellar. Much later, the image of a Flaschenpost, or message in a bottle, would reappear as a preferred metaphor for critical theory, a hopeful, if desperate, image of lessons cast into the future. Early in his life, the rebellious son of the Frankfurt bourgeoisie attached himself with fierce conviction to the new trends in aesthetic and philosophical modernism. Adorno found his initial inspiration in Nietzsche, Kafka, and Karl Kraus, writers whose talents for aphorism and paradox would serve as the model for his own dialectical criticism. In his early years at the University of Frankfurt, he developed a style of philosophical reflection that drew not only from the rich sources of German idealism, from Kant to Hegel, but also from thinkers such as Kierkegaard, Feuerbach, and Marx, who turned against the idealist confidence in reason and plunged philosophy into the turmoil of this worldly existence. Most of all, perhaps, Adorno was the child of his mother, Maria Caldelli Adorno, a talented opera singer who was determined to see that her son received a musical education. Beginning in the 1920s, the young man's aesthetic passions took him to Vienna, where he studied composition with Alban Berg and strengthened his bond with the musical modernism of Arnold Schoenberg and the Second Viennese School. It's one of the defining paradoxes of Adorno's thought that he was a radical steeped in tradition. In the twilight years of traditional humanism, Adorno seemed to welcome its demise, even as he became the very embodiment of European erudition. It's perhaps ironic that so many of his books, despite their stylistic difficulty and their willful resistance to facile categorization, now enjoy the ambivalent prestige of classics. The theorist of negativity and rupture also nourished the high bourgeois Proust for his psychological intimacy. The partisan of musical atonality also professed an undying love for Beethoven. He spent much of his later years collecting the notes for a never-published book that would demonstrate the sovereign place of the Bonn composer in the musical canon. In such respects, Adorno's relationship to the canon of high European culture was not that of mere opposition. It exemplified the stance of determinate negation, at once opposing and fulfilling the ideals of bourgeois modernity. In the early months of 1969, Adorno was engaged in a contest of political will with student activists on the German left who looked upon the aging representative of the Frankfurt Schule with suspicion and disappointment. They recognized, of course, that they owed him a great debt. In the post-war decades of conservatism and political conformity, Adorno, together with his colleague Max Horkheimer, had helped to awaken the spirit of resistance that had swept through the German universities in the later 1960s and had given birth to the extra-parliamentary opposition. But in the eyes of their students, the high theorists of resistance had failed the crucial test. When faced with radical demonstrators and with an occupation of the Institute's own building, Adorno had called upon the police to have these students expelled. A radical faction of the student movement was incensed at this betrayal and denounced Adorno for aligning himself with the establishment. The Frankfurt School had adopted a posture of political radicalism but refused to draw the political consequences. It did not cross the bridge from theory to practice, but resigned itself to the quietism of mere theory alone. In a February 1969 address on the Berlin radio, Adorno sought to defend himself against the charge of resignation. It was wrong, he said, to evaluate all ideas only in a practical light and for their worldly consequences. Such an attitude could only strengthen the authority of instrumental reason and the spirit of utility that had come to dominate late modern industrial society. Practice untethered from theory is pseudo-practice, he said. It degenerates into mere actionism and betrays the ideals it claims to realize. Against the imperatives of premature action, Adorno defended what he called the emphatic concept of thinking. Thinking, he said, is actually the force for resistance. Thinking promises this resistance, even though in Adorno's words it is not secured, nicht gedeckt. Not secured, not by the existing conditions, nor by ends yet to be achieved. Thinking, he explained, is not the intellectual reproduction of what already exists. Anyway, as long as it doesn't break off, thinking has a secure hold on possibility. Its insatiable aspect, its aversion to being quickly and easily satisfied, refuses the foolish wisdom of resignation. The utopian moment in thinking is stronger the less it, this too a form of relapse, objectifies itself into a utopia and hence sabotages its realization. Open thinking points beyond self. Now, for those who have learned from Adorno and continue to draw instruction from his work today, this late defense of emphatic thinking as a mode of resistance must appear in an ambivalent light. On the one hand, it speaks to the utopian impulse that animated Adorno's philosophy and moved him to hold fast to the ideal of a possible world beyond the hopelessness and suffering of present life. On the other hand, it seems to defer all action and even denies itself the satisfaction of any utopian concept, in the fear that utopia will betray criticism and solidify into an affirmative ideology. More troubling still, this denial of utopia extends so far that it refuses to countenance the prospect that critical thinking can be secured by anything, either in current society or in future ends. It should hardly surprise us that Adorno's defense of critical theory has left many of his readers dissatisfied. Following shortly after Adorno's death, Jürgen Habermas published a tribute to his teacher, in which he asked how critical theory can be justified. 50 years since his death, this question retains its urgency. In all of his work, Adorno adopts a critical posture. We should not accept present conditions as normatively authoritative merely because they happen to be the way things are. Against Hegel, Adorno refuses to award the prestige of the rational. The enormity of social suffering already invalidates any such identity. Under the name of a negative dialectics, he denies the authority of the given. He seeks to expose the untruth in what presents itself as truth, the negativity in what claims to be seamless identity. What makes this posture so difficult, however, is his apparent refusal to appeal to any independent norms that could serve as sources of critical leverage against untruth. He's especially resistant to the demand that he furnish a rational justification for his critical posture, because he believes that reason itself has been compromised by the one-sided and coercive process of social rationalization. Deontological ethics would require an appeal to discursive concepts. Kantian ethics, for example, is only possible if one remains committed to the concept of a universal law. But that kind of formalism already reflects the subject's domination over the object. Whatever normative standards we may have, Adorno seems to insist that they could not be made available to us in conceptual form. He concludes that critical thinking is not secured at all. The power of the present thus blocks, or at the very least distorts, any appeals to normativity in both the present and the future. Now, this may seem to leave Adorno's readers without any normative orientation whatsoever, but we cannot rest content with this skepticism. If Adorno is willing to forego any and all normative standards, then those who do not accept his criticism can simply dismiss his claims as arbitrary and without consequence. The question concerning the sources of normativity in Adorno's thought is not one we can easily escape. In what follows, I'll try to work out what I take to be a possible answer to this question. My lectures are organized into what one might call the three coordinate planes of Adorno's critical philosophy, corresponding more or less to the modes of transcendental inquiry as explored by Kant in his three critiques. For the sake of clarity, I'll describe these three coordinates in Adorno's work as materialism, or materialist experience, metaphysics, and aesthetics. Under the rubric of materialism, I'll discuss Adorno's commitment to the priority of the object and what this entails about the place of suffering and somatic experience in his thought. More on that to follow today. Under the rubric of metaphysics, on Thursday, I'll discuss the persistence of theological motifs in his work and how they persist in secular form as postulates for moral action. Finally, on Friday, under the rubric of aesthetics, I will address the ways in which the sensual and metaphysical themes join together in Adorno's concept of art, and especially music. Now, before I turn to the first of these topics, it may be important to explain why the question of normativity confronts us with equal urgency in all three domains. Adorno has, of course, a reputation as a great polymath who wrote on various themes and resisted the ideal of a unifying philosophical system. In his inaugural lecture in 1931, here at the University of Frankfurt, he speaks of a crisis in philosophy's pretensions to totality. And he faults both idealism and the new existential ontology alike for their ambition to grasp what he calls the totality of the real. Modern life, he says, has broken apart, perhaps irrevocably, into what he calls traces and ruins. And in this fragmented condition, philosophy must now forswear any attempt at resurrecting the old dream of totalizing solutions that once held it captive in the era of the grand idealist systems. Instead, Adorno suggests that philosophy should now pursue a path of experimentation. It should adopt the anarchic and aporetic style of the essay that will be best suited to exploring the constellations of our experience in all of its irreducible variety. This claim may only enhance our suspicion that Adorno's work does not prefer any singular and unifying answer to the question of normativity. To impose such an answer, one might think, would be to recapitulate the idealist will to subsume all of reality under one organizing concept, and this would reflect the domination of nature that Adorno wished to combat. This would appear to be a formidable objection, but I want to begin with an exploration as to why I believe it is mistaken. It is true, of course, that Adorno would not have wanted to collapse the various domains of philosophical inquiry into a unified whole organized in accordance with a single principle. He was especially keen to uphold the ideal of the relative autonomy of art in an age in which art was threatening to capitulate to the commodity form. When the logic of late capitalism dissolves all difference into sameness, our insistence on the separation of value spheres may appear itself as a protest against false totalization. But this objection is based on a misunderstanding. Although it's true that Adorno resists the attempt to subsume all value spheres under one concept, he's no less opposed to the fetishistic will to distinguish among different domains of human experience as if they were entirely distinct. Adorno does not accept, for instance, the Weberian image of modernity as broken into discrete value spheres. This Weberian conception of a one-sided rationalization leaves only instrumental reason as the common principle across all factual domains, while all decisions of value become the sovereign prerogative of the subject. Clearly, Adorno does not mean to endorse this conception of modernity. When he insists on a fragmentation in being, he nonetheless also insists that normative considerations about human suffering and the possibility of genuine freedom remain of relevance in all precincts of human experience. To believe otherwise would be to accept the economic ideology of specialization that makes it possible for norms of efficiency to assume a governing role in modern society. Such a division of labor would only help us to ignore the suffering that has attended the history of modern rationalization. In his 1964 lectures on philosophical elements of a theory of society, Adorno joked that those students who had been exposed to what he called his corrupting influence would know that he refused the commonplace distinctions among different academic trades. Against any fetishistic isolation of value spheres, then, Adorno insists that normative considerations retain their validity across each and every domain. It is the task of philosophy to remember the suffering that is hidden from view when instrumental reason becomes the sole criteria for a rationalized social order. In this respect, I want to argue that Adorno sustains an unlikely bond with Kant, insofar as he is committed to what Kant called the primacy of practical reason. The normative commitment that animates Adorno's thought is not confined only to the explicitly moral dimension of human conduct. It pervades all spheres of life, and there's no precinct of human experience in which its claims can be silenced. Needless to say, this argument raises the stakes for my inquiry. We need to answer not simply the local question as to what kind of moral or political philosophy Adorno may have held. We also need to answer the prior question as to what Adorno understood to be the proper source of normativity as such. We must address this question not only in moral reasoning, but also in theoretical and aesthetic considerations as well. Now, in posing this question, we confront a field of philosophical debate that has already attracted the labor of many scholars. Among the most serious and sustained attempts is the recent study by Fabian Freienhagen on Adorno's practical philosophy. Freienhagen wants to argue that Adorno subscribes to a view that he calls epistemic negativism. An epistemic negativist denies that we have any knowledge of the good. Like Hegel, Adorno believes that what is normative for any culture must come into historical being if we are to know its character. According to Freienhagen, this means that Adorno must deny that we possess any positive sense of what is good, since the entirety of our social world is wrong. Freienhagen defends this view of Adorno's epistemic negativism with extraordinary care, and concludes that Adorno might be seen as defending a kind of negative Aristotelianism. Adorno sees that there is a damaged and unfulfilled potential in the human being that serves as a kind of practical postulate. Humanity presently lives in a destitute condition. We exhibit what Freienhagen calls a widespread shortfall from our basic function. But this sense of shortfall implies an unrealized potential. And the potential has the status of an Aristotelian ergon, except for the important qualification that it is not yet available to us as a robust concept. In Negative Dialectics, Adorno writes, quote, "Every image of humanity other than the negative one is ideology." In this sense, it would seem that Freienhagen is correct to say that Adorno cannot ground his practical philosophy in any positive knowledge. Notwithstanding this epistemic negativism, however, Freienhagen tells us that in Adorno's thought, the counterfactual and unfulfilled potential itself serves as our norm. Here are some quotes. "We cannot currently know anything positive about this potential, but without it, we cannot make sense of the world." And elsewhere, Freienhagen writes, "The current social world is so deeply delusional that we cannot even conceptualize or imagine what realized humanity would consist in." In my view, Freienhagen's argument stands as one of the most ambitious and fruitful efforts to answer the question of normativity in Adorno's thought. It goes a long way toward helping us to understand the meaning behind Adorno's enigmatic dictum, "Es gibt kein richtiges Leben im Falschen." There is no right life in the false. If we are plunged completely and without qualification into a false society, then it would seem to follow that we have no norms available to us that could serve as resources for criticism and resistance. Freienhagen wants to rescue Adorno from this impasse by appealing to a potential of basic human functioning that remains unrealized in our false society, but permits us to identify what is false. This is why Freienhagen tells us that our normative orientation itself can only be negative. It is directed against the bad rather than toward the good. The best Adorno can counsel is an ethics of living less wrongly. The difficulty with this view, however, is that Freienhagen has not resolved the puzzle of epistemic negativism with which he begins. He cannot explain how the unrealized potential of basic human functioning would be known. If false life is false because it inhibits the realization of this potential, then the concept of the false is contrasted. It already implies the concept of the true. To know what it is for life to be damaged, one must have at least some sense of what an undamaged life would be like. I would suggest that Freinagen finds himself in this difficulty only because he proposes a hyperbolic view of Adorno's negativism. A moment ago, I quoted his strongest claim that, quote, the current social world is so deeply delusional that we cannot even conceptualize or imagine what realized humanity would consist in. This thesis, I should note, has a longer history, and it has long been responsible for the widespread public perception that Adorno and his colleagues were theorists of radical pessimism who could offer no counsel as to how the world might be improved. The thesis figures as the central claim in Michael Teunissen's well-known essay, Negativität by Adorno, from 1983, and it received a kind of confirmation in the 1994 book by Michael Pauen, Dithyrambiker des Untergangs, in which Adorno appears alongside philosophers such as Heidegger and Klages as exponents of what Pauen calls a late modern reprisal of Gnosticism. But it should be obvious to us that Adorno does not paint the world in such extravagant blackness as would inhibit our present glimpse of alternative ways of being human. It's surely right that Adorno sees our current world as damaged. But damage is not absolute destruction. And we should avoid the error of turning his negativism into a totalizing ideology that has effaced all dialectical light. Among the most contested questions in the history of critical theory is whether it can hold fast to its critique of social rationalization without lapsing into a performative contradiction. In the Philosophical Discourse of Modernity, Habermas claims that the authors of Dialectic of Enlightenment left themselves vulnerable to this verdict because their critique of instrumental reason metastasized into a totalizing critique of reason as such, and they did not leave themselves the resources they required to justify their own critical efforts. Adorno seems to invite this charge, especially in the aphorisms published in Minima Moralia just after the war. He writes, for instance, that, quote, there is not a crevice in the cliff of the established order into which the ironist might hook a fingernail. Freinagen alerts us to this aphorism, and he suggests that what is true for the ironist would be true for the critical theorist as well. Modern society has become wholly affirmative, and it has shut down any knowledge of alternatives. This thesis, however, has obvious disadvantages. No critical social theory can be valid if it does not respond to the challenge of self-reflexivity. It must offer a portrait of the social world that also explains the conditions of its own possibility. A theory that advertises itself as critical cannot believe that society has closed every crevice without eliminating the conceptual space in which criticism itself would be possible. If Adorno actually believed that there were no spalts, no crevice in the established order, he would be vulnerable to the charge of performative contradiction. My claim might be restated in Hegelian terms. The interpretation of Adorno as a total negativist conflates determinate negation with abstract negation. It misses the internal contradictions in the present. Or to put the matter in more poetic terms, it casts Adorno in the unlikely role of Goethe's Mephistopheles, who said, Ich bin der Geist, der stets verneint, und das mit Recht. Denn alles, was entsteht, ist wert, dass es zugrunde geht. Needless to say, Adorno was not Mephistopheles. And the original premise is mistaken insofar as it seriously overstates the degree to which Adorno is a theorist of total negativity. We can further appreciate this point by examining Adorno's arguments from three perspectives: stylistic, historical, and philosophical. First, as good readers of Adorno, we start off on the wrong foot when we fail to consider the stylistic force of aphoristic writing that he had inherited from models such as Nietzsche and Klaus. The rhetorical status of an aphorism cannot be assimilated to the truth status of a philosophical proposition. Its purpose is to push to an extremity insights that will have a sufficient power, in Nietzsche's words, of, quote, shattering and mocking the old conceptual barriers that protect what counts as common sense. Adorno borrows from Nietzsche the hyperbolic form of the aphorism, not for the purposes of social description, but with a monitory intent. He offers a proleptic and anticipatory statement of what society will become if present tendencies are permitted to continue. Adorno tells us that present-day ideology has dispensed with the need to dissimulate. The culture industry no longer tries to hide what is wrong in our lives. It portrays our current existence as an unbroken surface that sees all suffering as necessary fate. But this is clearly an exaggeration. It describes the ideological justification for the current order, even while the suffering this order creates obviously persists. The modal status of that hyperbolic remark is critical rather than straightforwardly descriptive. It stands in stark contradiction to the well-known aphorism at the end of Minima Moralia, where Adorno suggests that we must appeal to a counterfactual ideal of redemption, by whose light the rifts and crevices, the Risse und Strübe, of the current order will be cast in relief. The image of society as one of thoroughgoing despair is not meant to encourage despair. It is meant to inoculate us against despair with a critical consciousness that alerts us to the nightmare features of our own emergent condition. It's true, of course, that Adorno occasionally writes as if critique can find no point of leverage against the world, no cracks for one's fingernails, but his assessment of present-day social domination is one where Adorno more typically uses metaphors that suggest fragmentation rather than unbroken perfection. Our critical efforts would not be possible if some light were not available to illumine the broken surface that surrounds us. Second, from an historical perspective, it's perhaps unsurprising that some of the darkest characterizations of modern society as total catastrophe are to be found in texts from the 1940s, such as Dialectic of Enlightenment and Minima Moralia. As early as February 1940, Adorno writes in a letter to his parents about the future of Germany, and he connects it to the questions of the growing threat of fascism elsewhere. He writes that he harbors no comforting illusions about Germany. That if he harbors no comforting illusions about Germany, this is only because he has no such illusions about the world. Fascism in Germany, he writes, is by no means a psychological anomaly of the German national character. Rather, it is what he calls a universal tendency. The old dream that Jews could survive the fascist threat by mingling with others is no longer viable. It is too late, Adorno writes. The business has taken on the character of catastrophe. Essentially, I am convinced, he says, that one is hopelessly trapped regardless of where one may be. He concludes that the only chance to survive the horror, and by no means one that I rate highly, is for fascism to collapse in Germany before it breaks out here in the United States. The tone in this report reflects the time in which it was written. The specific hope that fascism might be defeated in Europe does not outweigh the generalized anxiety that it will triumph in America, and that its ascent reflects a universal tendency, if not yet an established fact. Adorno admits that his sentiments are, quote, drastic, but they are nonetheless for him overwhelming. In a March 1943 letter to his parents, Adorno refers to the murder of millions of Jews in Germany, but again expresses the fear that even if Hitler should be defeated, the system he represents and, quote, all it implies will survive, quote, on the other side. In an opening chapter of Dialectic of Enlightenment, published just 1 year later, the same sentiment takes on the apodictic grandeur of a philosophical argument. But the abstraction of Adorno's philosophical reflections on modern catastrophe should not deflect our attention from the historical specificity of the suffering to which they refer. If we lose sight of this specificity, we commit a serious error. the philosopheme of total catastrophe inflates suffering into a universal concept and thereby obscures its particular origins. An interpretation that sees Adorno as a theorist of total social falsehood loses touch with this particularity, and it becomes a dark mirror to the philosophical idealism Adorno wished to combat. Finally, from a philosophical perspective, the understanding of Adorno as an epistemic negativist is too strong insofar as it cannot explain his interest in the surviving moments of experience in our damaged world that point beyond its current ruin to its genuine reconciliation. This will serve as my organizing theme. If Adorno sustains any enduring bond with the left Hegelian tradition, it is the thought that the present always contains an anticipation of its own negation. But the negation of the present is also the fulfillment of its unrealized dreams. One of the very first texts that Adorno wrote upon his return from the United States to Germany in 1949 was Cultural Criticism and Society, an essay that was dedicated to the sociologist Leopold von Wiese and first published in a 1951 volume on the occasion of the latter's 75th birthday. Immanent criticism, Adorno tells us, will see its object not as one that resolves objective contradictions in a spurious harmony. Instead, it will see the object as one that expresses the idea of harmony negatively by embodying the contradictions, pure and uncompromised in its innermost structure. This essay is often read chiefly as a statement of Adorno's views on the practice of cultural and aesthetic critique. But if we recall that it was intended as a contribution to debates in sociology, we will recognize that it offers an important defense of immanent criticism as a general method of interpretation. Not only in the artwork, but also in society, Adorno adopts what he calls a micrological method that burrows deep into the object to discover the internal moments of contradiction that point from the false to the true. I want to suggest that this emphasis on the negative does not entail a lapse into total negativism. No master concept of total negativity governs all of experience without mediation. And in negative dialectics, we are told that it is only in a false world that the non-identical appears as the negative. This means that the negative is actually the promise of future reconciliation. It only seems negative because it is the negation of an unreconciled present. These three considerations speak against the interpretation of totalizing negativity, and they encourage us to read Adorno as a thinker who resists all totalization even when he seems most inclined to despair. It's a commonplace view that especially toward the end of his life, Adorno retreated into the aesthetic sphere of bourgeois modernism. This view misses the fact that Adorno sees the work of art just as he sees society, as a damaged or even broken artifact that thematizes without resolution both our human suffering and our normative ambitions as social and historical beings. With this interpretive method, Adorno shows how both aesthetic and social concerns come to thematic awareness in such a way that a successful work of art can serve as a monad that sustains its autonomy even while it offers a mediated picture of the social whole of which it is a part. Before I turn to the topic of Adorno's materialism, I want to dwell momentarily on this question of immanent critique by recalling Adorno's 1955 lecture on bourgeois opera. The highest specimens of bourgeois opera, Adorno writes, have always resisted the seductions of myth. They have sought to correct myth through music, and they remain committed to what Adorno calls the Enlightenment as a total social movement. This is the case in Fidelio, Beethoven's unique venture into opera from 1805, in which the heroine Leonora rescues her husband Florestan from a Spanish prison. In Act 2, Florestan sings Gott welch dunkel hier, God what darkness here, but he consoles himself with the image of his wife Leonora, about whom he sings, Ein Engel, Leonora, der Garten sogleich, der führt mich zur Freiheit ins himmlische Reich. This longing for redemption is not only personal. Act 1 concludes with the famous scene in which the band of prisoners are temporarily permitted entry into the sunlight, where the chorus sings, O welche Lust, oh what joy, before they are conducted back into the darkness and they bid the sunshine farewell. Leb wohl, du warmst Sonnenlicht. Now, why am I going on about opera? For Adorno, Beethoven's opera illustrates the philosophical problem concerning the relationship between the Enlightenment and hope. In the late modern era, when the Enlightenment may seem to have betrayed its true promise, and the disenchanted world seems to have confined us all to an iron cage or prison, there is a great risk that we will come to think of redemption as an unrealized and metaphysical ideal that stands absolutely opposed to present darkness. But in the essay on bourgeois drama, Adorno warns us against precisely that perspective. The dream of metaphysical redemption becomes little more than ideology, he says, when it is conceived in its conventional form as an abstract principle that stands opposed to and outside of history. For this reason, he says, the arrival of the minister Don Fernando at the opera's finale offers little more than an authoritarian solution, one that betrays the ideal of genuine freedom. But metaphysics today, Adorno says, has an altogether different meaning. A meaning that becomes all the more effective, the more deeply its ideas, he says, quote, embed themselves in history. Our imprisonment in a blind and unself-conscious system, he says, cannot be dissociated from the idea of freedom that arises in its midst. Metaphysics, he concludes, is not an unchanging realm to be grasped by looking out through the barred windows of the historical to some beyond. He says, instead it is the glimmer, albeit a powerless glimmer, of light which falls into the prison itself. Now, I thought it might be suitable to recall Adorno's essay on bourgeois opera because it contains what I take to be a helpful distinction between two ways of thinking about the question of normativity in his work. Notice that for Adorno, there's no advantage in thinking about normativity in accordance with the traditional distinction between mundane and transmundane realms. If we believe that all hope must come from a place of transcendence that lies wholly beyond the present order, we only confirm the power of ideology and the hopelessness of our current situation. Adorno strenuously resists this Gnostic conclusion. Instead, he enjoins us to recognize that the metaphysical ideal of freedom retains its truth value only if it is a light that reveals itself within the immanent space of social reality. Fidelio speaks to both moments of the dialectic of enlightenment because it entertains redemption as both ideology and truth. It is not the authoritarian persona of Don Fernando, as announced by the trumpets at the end, that heralds our redemption. Adorno says, it is the faint trace of sunlight that still warms the prisoners even when they are confined to their cells. That illustration will suffice, I believe, to demonstrate Adorno's commitment to a method of immanent critique. The sources of normativity that remain valid for Adorno do not lie beyond the bars of our social prison. They are available to us in the half-light that still shines within the social world, despite the gathering darkness. As a final note, I should explain, however, that if we're seeking sources of normativity in the sense of rational grounding, we're bound to disappointment. Adorno saw rational justification as an uncertain and second-order task, one that could not furnish the apodictic certainty his idealist predecessors had imagined. The sources of moral insight that animate his works are not secured, bedecked by reason. They are something like phenomenological models, fleeting experiences or anticipations of material happiness that we can barely glimpse as the totality of social relations places genuine happiness under a ban. This is the argument I hope to defend with a thematic discussion of the sources of normativity in the three domains of materialism, metaphysics, and aesthetics. As a member of the Frankfurt School, Adorno is often categorized as a representative of Western Marxism, though what appears as a materialist orientation in Adorno shares only certain rudimentary themes with the historical materialism associated with Marx. In the initial stages of planning in the early 1920s, the Institute for Social Research was originally called the Institute for Marxism, and students continued for a long time to refer to it affectionately as the Café Marx, and eventually, after 1931, Café Max. But even in its early stages, the Institute diverged from any kind of Marxist orthodoxy. And especially once Max Horkheimer assumed its directorship, the Institute's interdisciplinary program for critical theory began to follow the research agenda that Horkheimer, in his 1931 inaugural address, called social philosophy. This agenda sought to develop a comprehensive picture of the social world that would understand the mediated and non-reductive relations among economy, individual psychology, and culture. Horkheimer was not embarrassed to defend culture in the broadest terms. It would include, he said, not only the so-called intellectual elements, such as science, art, and religion, but also law, customs, fashion, public opinion, sports, leisure activities, lifestyle, etc. They could study the race right outside their window. This broad schema permitted the Institute to pursue a multidisciplinary agenda, even as Horkheimer tried to sustain a dialectical vision of the social whole. Already in the inaugural address, Horkheimer warned that to see material being as the only true reality and to see all of culture and philosophy as mere reflections of the economy would be to misunderstand Marx abstractly, he said, and thus badly. But the essential point of contact between critical theory and Marxism was not a positive doctrine, but a negative orientation that struggles with and against the legacy of German idealism. All of the spheres of life that appear as objects of research in Horkheimer's program for social philosophy are those he ascribes to Hegel's concept of objective spirit. Horkheimer wished to pursue social research by remaining true to this Hegelian vision of a mediated whole. But he also tried to resist falling into the idealist mistake of awarding spirit any metaphysical priority. The task of a social philosophy was to redeem the Hegelian thesis of social mediation from its idealist metaphysics, so that the materialist motive could emerge without lapsing into the bad alternative of a materialist reductionism. But the truth is that Horkheimer was always closer to historical materialism than his colleague. In Adorno's thought, the philosophical complaint against idealism is primary, but it never reaches its resolution in a doctrinal commitment to Marxism. Unlike Horkheimer's thesis of Hegelian mediation, Adorno insists on the fractured character of a society that is poised without resolution between two false moments, material and cultural. This tension might be understood biographically. The son of a Frankfurt businessman and a musically gifted mother saw in his own family how the difference between economics and aesthetics could be thematized but not resolved. This tension remained a pronounced feature in Adorno's mature personality. On the one hand, he tried as hard as he could to insist on the primacy of the object. On the other hand, his aesthetic and specifically musical sensitivities meant that he responded with deepest revulsion whenever he suspected that the materialist motif threatened to extinguish the relative autonomy of the aesthetic spirit. Adorno remained throughout his life hostile to any theory of subject-object mediation that menaced that autonomy, and he understood the dialectic not as a medium for reconciliation, but as a logic of opposition. Already in Adorno's earliest philosophical writings on psychoanalysis and phenomenology, one can glimpse in an oblique way how the polemic against idealism turns toward materialism without seeking to abolish the truth moment in idealist thinking. In his 1924 thesis, The Transcendence of the Thing and the Noematic in Husserl's Phenomenology, the 21-year-old student of Hans Cornelius focuses on the division in Husserl's work between being as consciousness and being as reality. Still committed to the neo-Kantian perspectives of his teacher, Adorno sees in Husserlian phenomenology an idealistic ambition to identify reality with the contents of consciousness, even while these contents nonetheless refer to the absolute transcendence of the thin world, the Dingwelt. In this interpretation, transcendent reality appears as a Kantian Ding an sich. The materialist motif first arises like a feature on the distant horizon within the landscape of Kantian idealism. A similar gesture, I would say, can be found in the concept of the unconscious in the transcendental theory of the soul, which Adorno submitted to Cornelius in 1927 in a first but unsuccessful attempt at debilitation. Here, psychoanalysis is subjected to a species of immanent critique so as to discover its own latent materialism. Not only knowledge of unconscious facts, but also their constitution are shown to be dependent on the material world, namely on society. This interpretation reads the unconscious not as a static or permanent reserve of individual drives, but as the internal deposit of social content. The characteristic gesture of the mature philosophy is already evident. Adorno does not wish to leave the terrain of idealism. He means to challenge its authority from within. This internal turning toward materialism is a central theme in the actuality of philosophy, Adorno's 1931 inaugural lecture at the University of Frankfurt. The Privatdozent begins his official career as a philosopher by declaring an end to the philosophical tradition. Philosophy, he says, can no longer accept the old dogma that thought has a power that would be sufficient to grasp the totality of the real. What Adorno calls the crisis about idealism means that reason must now confess its powerlessness. The fullness of the real will not allow itself to be subsumed under the idea of being. The thesis of a fragmented reality already suggests a certain difference of opinion between Adorno and Horkheimer. Where Horkheimer retains a commitment to the mediated totality of social experience under the inherited Hegelian name of objective spirit, Adorno resists this gesture of mediation. Following Benjamin, he speaks instead of a constellation. The task of philosophy is no longer to search for concealed intentions, but to interpret the unintentional reality that is constructed as disconnected images from the isolated elements of the real. The revolt against intention is clearly intended as a strike against idealism, though this term embraces a multitude of schools, including both Marburg Neo-Kantianism and Heideggerian ontology. Adorno sees these apparent rivals as part of a common impulse to grasp reality as an intelligible whole. Philosophical idealism, he tells us, remains captive to the problem concerning the relationship between the thing and itself in appearance. Against idealism, Adorno aligns himself with materialism, but his use of this term is already idiosyncratic. Materialism, in his mind, means the interpretation of the unintentional. Interpretation, in the materialist sense, will require a juxtaposition of the smallest elements of social reality, where these elements are the, quote, refuse of the physical world. As an illustration of this method, Adorno suggests the example of the commodity form. To interpret reality in the light of the commodity form will permit us to see it as an intentionless truth that structures all of society rather than as a hidden meaning that lies beneath society as its secret. Adorno further claims that this interpretive strategy exemplifies Marx's famous demand that philosophy should move beyond interpretation to changing the world. The mature Marx tried to fulfill this demand by developing a critique of political economy, in which the reproduction of material life assumes primacy as the mediated force of social change. But Adorno believes that he can fulfill Marx's demand without ever abandoning the terrain of thought. For him, the 11th thesis on Feuerbach does not mean stepping beyond the threshold of interpretation into political praxis. It means a change within philosophical theory itself. Adorno's idea of materialist criticism never abandons philosophy for political economy. It becomes an immanent critique of idealism, one that shatters the illusion of holistic meaning from the inside. Until the end of his life, Adorno remained faithful to this idea. In the 1962 summer semester seminar, Marx and the Basic Concepts of Sociological Theory, Adorno tries to explain why a Marxist critique cannot rest content with the phenomenon of alienation. For alienation, he tells us, itself remains an idealist category. We fasten exclusively on the pathologies of consciousness, and we thereby obscure the fact that alienation results from the commodity character of the economy. The crucial thought here is that to exercise materialist criticism does not entail a shift of terrain from interpretation to economic analysis. And this places Adorno in an unusual position. On the one hand, he rejects the proposal that Marxism would be satisfied with a critique of consciousness, since this would amount to a re-idealization of Marxist categories. On the other hand, he refuses to abandon the practice of interpretation for a theory that would read consciousness as a mere epiphenomenon. His understanding of interpretation sustains a materialist emphasis, but without materialistic reduction. Nor can Adorno embrace Marxism on a level of metaphysics. As a theory of bourgeois society, Marxism correctly locates the secret of social reproduction in the fact of exploited labor. But as a theory of all social reality, it ends by affirming the necessity it was meant to dismantle. Epiphenomenalism in bourgeois society appears as a metaphysical truth only because bourgeois society has obscured the mechanism of its own longevity. But, Adorno reasons, if epiphenomenalism is taken to be an ahistorical truth, then there is no longer any reason to protest against the causal mechanism. Marxism loses its normative commitment to a still unrealized ideal of freedom. It becomes not a theory aiming for utopia, but an affirmation of a reductive and mechanistic dystopia. This is the deeper meaning behind Adorno's remark that Marx wanted to turn the entire world into a giant workhouse. Now, it seems obvious that Adorno is not a proponent of historical materialism strictu sensu. He has no investment whatsoever in the revolutionary ambitions of a class-conscious proletariat. He has no confidence in the anonymous development of technology as the precondition for historical progress, and he sees little warrant for the post-Enlightenment optimism that regards history as an open field for the self-realization of the human species. But in a more general, less doctrinal sense, Adorno nonetheless sustains just enough of his fidelity to materialism to insist on the priority of material conditions and the irreducible fact of human suffering as the core phenomenon that no philosophy can be permitted to ignore. The emphasis on worldly conditions belongs to the motivating principles of his negative dialectic. Adorno's own materialism begins with the insight that our concepts are not identical or sufficient to the objects to which they refer. A concept, by definition, is a universal that subsumes the particularity and plenitude of the object. Only as transformed into a concept can the object be brought into the discursive space of the mind, where it becomes the mind's possession and enters into commerce with other concepts for the purposes of reflection. In this sense, Adorno sees the concept as an instrument that enhances the subject's claim to priority over the world. Conceptuality itself, for Adorno, serves the domination of nature. But already in this theory of domination, Adorno hastens to note that domination can never be complete. The concept qua universal does not and cannot capture the full particularity of the object. This basic insufficiency of the concept alerts us to what is false in the subject's claim to primacy. The subject that would like to assert its discursive mastery over the world may wish to ignore the insufficiency of its concepts, but it cannot wholly dismantle the fact of a material dependency that outstrips its own conceptual grasp. The object, in this sense, enjoys a certain priority over the subject. This insight into the priority of the object is not only the central theme of Adorno's materialism, it is also the point at which the normative dimension of Adorno's thought first becomes apparent. If we've missed this normative aspect, it's only because we've preferred to read Adorno as a theorist of totalizing negativity. In Dialectic of Enlightenment, Adorno and Horkheimer write that each advance of civilization has renewed not only mastery, but also the prospect of its alleviation. Modern society has indeed grown dark, but it is not plunged into such complete blackness as to obviate the hope for its illumination. The concept of the Enlightenment itself contains the unfulfilled promise that would consist in overcoming its distorting effects. Immanent criticism, or what Adorno and Horkheimer call the self-reflection of thought, remains a possibility, and the dismantling of domination would mean holding fast to an enlightenment that is true to its own promise. However, this does not mean that the normative ideal of a life beyond domination derives merely from a concept. The authors of Dialectic of Enlightenment looked upon the discursive intellect with great suspicion. Already in the bare logic of concept formation, they discerned an early sign of the exchange economy that subsumes the particular under the universal and dissolves all difference in order to transform material reality into fungible value. This means that they could not simply locate normativity in the Enlightenment as a mere idea. When they insist that enlightened thought must become self-reflective, they mean that enlightened thought must also sustain an awareness of its own natural character, even while it also takes its distance from nature. This genuinely dialectical and self-reflective character of enlightenment would be what they called the remembrance of nature within the subject. Adorno remained faithful to this idea. The complaint against idealism that runs through all of his philosophy, from the inaugural lecture in Frankfurt all the way through the lectures and published philosophical studies of the 1960s, converge on the thought that idealism is the formal name for a pattern of social domination that has remained in force ever since the human animal first struggled to wrest itself free from nature. Enlightenment is true to its own concept only when it combines the freedom from natural necessity with the higher and self-reflective acknowledgement of the nature within human nature. The materialist motif of the remembrance of nature announces a protest not only against a one-sided enlightenment that celebrates its own capacity for domination, it is also a protest on behalf of the distorted nature that suffers from such domination. Adorno makes precisely this point, and with great moral pathos, and without embarrassment, in the introductory section of Negative Dialectics. The need to give voice to suffering, he says, is the condition of all truth. Here we can see that suffering is conceived in the broadest possible terms. From the materialist point of departure that assigns primacy to the object, Adorno defines suffering as, quote, the objectivity which weighs on the subject. Now, this is a striking claim. It should alert us to the difficulty of reading Adorno in light of conventional philosophical expectations that want to distinguish between theoretical and practical reason, or between is and ought, sein and soll. Adorno appears ready to trespass the boundaries between these modes of speculation when he identifies objective truth as a need or as a requirement. By insisting on this need, Adorno makes truth itself into a normative category. Truth becomes not merely a statement of what is the case, but the imperative that we must recognize what is the case against all distortions, both material and ideological, that we keep this truth concealed. This is the deeper impulse that animates all of Adorno's critical interventions in the philosophical tradition. Through immanent critique, he seeks to expose the non-identical as the truth that idealist philosophies have suppressed. But this is not only for him a philosophical exercise, it's also an exercise in social critique. Adorno aims to show that idealism is the formal and intellectualized correlate to social oppression. The immanent critique of idealism is also the immanent critique of our social experience as natural beings who have structured our second nature in such a way that our natural suffering remains hidden. The remembrance of nature serves as a normative impulse for Adorno because it permits the nature we have repressed to cry out against domination. Suffering is already in itself a protest against a world that has made suffering into its precondition. Here we can see why it's misleading to call Adorno a theorist of absolute negativism. If our lives are false, this is because we can still hear in social suffering the cry of a suppressed nature that, even in its distortion, points toward an undistorted society. 2 points need to be made about this argument. First, notice that in the normative appeal to nature, Adorno does not think he has committed the philosophical mistake of conflating normativity with mere fact. The Wittgensteinian formula, Die Welt ist alles, was der Fall ist, strikes Adorno's ears as a call to totalitarian resignation. In resisting that call, critical theory stands opposed to the authority of the given. This is why it regards with suspicion all those attempts, from Aristotle to Heidegger, that are content to assign the ultimate normative status to an invariant or ontological condition that belongs to the human being simply in virtue of its being. The given cannot be endorsed simply as and because it is given. The Aristotelian category of the natural slave reminds us why this cannot be right. But how can Adorno resist the authority of the given if he's willing to assign primacy to the object? This brings me to my second point. In asking that we heed the primacy of the object, Adorno is not suggesting that we cast aside our own discursivity and regress to a condition of unmediated fusion. Any such effort would mean abandoning the cognitive achievements that we have secured over the course of history, notwithstanding the fact that these gains have been made at the cost of our own happiness. This is why Adorno speaks of remembrance of nature rather than a mere return to nature. Suffering cannot be redressed by a backwards retreat from society. It can only be redressed from the standpoint of an enlightened consciousness that dialectically acknowledges the primacy of the object, even as it sustains its partial independence. The normative status of nature for Adorno becomes apparent when we recall how often he develops his immanent critique of modern society through what he calls a micrological study of the surviving traces of natural happiness. As I'll explain in the third lecture, this interpretive method is crucial to his views on modern art. But the same method is already on display in the brilliant aphorisms on everyday life collected in 1951 as Minima Moralia. Now, it's not by accident that many of these readings fasten our attention on the minute details of material existence, especially on those quotidian moments in which we can still catch sight of the specific happiness that is going into eclipse. As I come now to the final 10 minutes of this opening lecture, I'll mention only 3 examples. In her purposeless activity, Adorno writes, the child at play takes sides with use value against exchange value. She deprives the toys of their usefulness and seeks to rescue in them what is benign toward them. In the unreality of children's games, we are permitted to see that reality is not yet real. These games are signs of utopia in the midst of distortion. Unconsciously, Adorno tells us, The games of childhood anticipate an adult world that lies beyond our false conception of maturity. And here's the key line. They are games that rehearse or exercise the right life. The same anticipatory promise appears in the relationship between children and animals. Utopia, Adorno writes, inheres in the creatures that exist without any purpose. Children are especially alive to the utter particularity of animals, whose own names seem impossible to exchange. This is why children love animals and experience such happiness in contemplating them. With this argument, Adorno repeats the Adamic theory of proper names developed by his friend Walter Benjamin. The nominalist specificity of a name that cannot be exchanged becomes, for Adorno, the memory trace in the child's imagination of a mimetic relationship to nature. It may be that there is no right life, richtiges Leben, im Falschen, no right life in the false, but there are still exercises or rehearsals for the right life. And this quote is a helpful rejoinder to the quote, which is so much more famous, more typically associated with Adorno. In a different aphorism, from just a few years later, Adorno laments the fact that we are forgetting how to give gifts. Like the proper name, the present that is freely given in expectation of the recipient's joy cannot be absorbed into the administrative benevolence of a capitalist society. It signals the persistence of relations that are rapidly vanishing. Adorno writes of the irreplaceable faculties that cannot flourish in the isolated cell of pure inwardness, but survive, he says, only in live contact with the warmth of things. Not unlike Marcel Mauss, whom Adorno does not mention here, the practice of the gift becomes in this analysis a sign for a different and embattled humanity. Every undistorted relationship is a gift, Adorno writes. And so, too, we might characterize as a gift, quote, the conciliation that is a part of organic life itself. Das Besonnende am organischen Leben selber. This strange appeal to the utopian moment in organic life becomes most explicit, perhaps, in the aphorism from 1944 that bears the title, This Side of the Pleasure Principle. In a sly allusion to Freud's controversial and revisionist study of 1920 that introduced the idea of a death drive alongside the libido into the psychoanalytic theory of drives, Adorno criticizes Freud for his ambivalent stance toward happiness. On the one hand, Adorno says, a psychoanalysis emerged in opposition to Victorian morality, and it announced the open emancipation of the oppressed. But on the other hand, Adorno says, it aligned itself with conservative moralism and offered an apology for open repression. The advocate of psychological science, who spoke with skepticism about religion and said that heaven should be left to the angels and the sparrows, is the same hard-boiled old gentleman, Adorno writes, who damns in pious horror the perverse practices of a pleasure-loving society. Against Freud, Adorno insists that the utopian promise that religion consigns to a disembodied place beyond mundane life has its actual location in the body itself. He alone who could situate utopia in blind somatic pleasure has a stable and valid idea of truth, end quote. In this lecture, I've tried to suggest that Adorno's materialism can be understood in the broadest sense as a turn toward nature as the site of normativity. I should emphasize once again that the turn toward nature does not imply a regression to nature. Here we must agree with theorists who wish to call attention to the primacy of negativity in Adorno's work. The natural or blind somatic pleasure that figures as utopia retains its normative status only insofar as it stands in contrast to the coldness and repression of bourgeois society. This is why it is simply not possible to claim that Adorno promotes living less wrongly, as if this term did not already immediately imply the correlative ideal of a life lived rightly. The ideas are contrastive. one entails the other. Rather than capitulating in despair to the false world, Adorno upholds what he calls the frail image of the right one. Notice that Adorno does not deny all knowledge of the right life. Although it is true that its image has grown pale, it has not vanished entirely. What Adorno calls bourgeois coldness can be resisted only because he can still sense the warmth that emanates from nature even in its distorted condition. I'll bring this lecture to a close by noting the constant recurrence of this materialist motif throughout Adorno's work. It appears not only in those studies that conform to the style of conventional philosophy, such as the eminent critiques of Kant, Hegel, Husserl, and Heidegger. It appears even in the most empirical works of sociological research that Adorno undertook during the war in partnership with colleagues, first in the States and later in Frankfurt. It shouldn't be forgotten that at the university here, Adorno's title was Professor of Philosophy and Sociology. The most famous of the empirical studies was no doubt the authoritarian personality, the 1950 landmark exercise in social psychology to which Adorno contributed while still living in California. Now, I just have about 2 more minutes to explain something. Much has been written about this study, especially in the most recent years, when it has assumed a new relevance as we witness the resurgence of political authoritarianism across the globe. Without delving into a sustained analysis, I'd like to call attention to a crucial fact. It's a long text. I won't read it all. In a chapter authored by Adorno alone, he includes a section, section 8, with the stark title, "There Will Be No Utopia." Here he offers contrasting portraits of 2 individuals, one who scores high on the F scale for fascism, and a second who scores low. High-scoring individuals deny all utopian thought because they insist that one must be realistic, while those who score low are also skeptical about utopia, but for a rather different reason. So, permit me to indulge in one final reading of this argument. The low-scoring individuals are skeptical about utopia, Adorno tells us, because they take its realization seriously and therefore take a critical view of the existent, even up to the point where they acknowledge the threat exercised by prevailing conditions against, he says, just those human potentialities in which they trust in the depths of their hearts. In this passage, Adorno does more than present us with 2 contrasting types. The low-scoring person is the crucial site of critical possibility, because it is the type of the critical theorist himself. In fact, the language Adorno employs here is so familiar, it is tempting to say that he has provided us with a kind of self-portrait. In this lecture, I've argued that Adorno cannot be an epistemic negativist because throughout his work he identifies preserves of normativity that have survived at the margins of an unfree world. On this point, Adorno was clear. In Negative Dialectics, he writes that existence has gaps that expose identity as a lie. And in these gaps, we can see that the existent is shot through with promises of happiness, even if in our world these promises are constantly broken. An epistemic negativist, by definition, could not appeal to such preserves, since they allow for a fleeting knowledge of truth in the midst of the false. This knowledge, of course, stands only as the most minimal readout against the dominant trends in society. In a false world, no one is permitted an unobstructed vision of the truth. A mind that suffers from social distortion will glimpse utopia itself only in a distorted form. But I will close by noting what I take to be a serious challenge. If we deny to Adorno even the most minimalist appeal to utopia, we would be forced to rank him among the high-scoring individuals who align themselves with the existent order. Everything in Adorno's thought cries out against such a conclusion. Next two lectures will not be that long.
So I propose that everyone who intends to leave should leave now, because we have now 20 minutes for discussion, and it would be good if we could be quiet.
Was it something I said?
I think we can start. Who wants to start with the first question? Yes, there.
Yeah, okay. So my question is about how the normative thoughts you give here, that is to say, turning towards nature really functions as a source of normativity. In the beginning part, you criticized the idea to regard Adorno as a total negativism. You said that in order to criticize, we have to know a picture of what undamaged life is. And so the final picture you gave us, that is to say materialism as turning toward nature, should we understand it as, for example, a reference point in which indicates what the so-called undamaged life is, and it is the source of normativity in the sense that it's a so-called reference point for a real life, or how do we understand it?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you're fastening your attention, of course, on the core pivotal question that I'm trying to answer, and I can't fully answer it until the end of the third lecture, but I'll try to anticipate it here. There's a phrase that for me is perhaps the most instructive phrase in all of negative dialectics, where Adorno ends. He says every particular happiness is a fragment of the total happiness which humanity is denied. And to me that's a crucial thought, and I'll come back to that at the end. It's the thought that there are moments of happiness, very particular ones that are fleeting, partial, themselves even distorted or damaged, that show us in our natural somatic being enjoying a kind of natural happiness, the kind that typically bourgeois society represses. Now Adorno is keen to say that from a systemic point of view, that happiness is denied. And because it's only particular, it is therefore false. This is why I think the aphorism has been completely misunderstood. The aphorism is not saying there aren't such moments. We see Adorno writing about those moments all the time. When he says false life, im falschen, he means the total system. No life can be wholly true when the system in which it's embedded is false, but nonetheless, those moments of happiness are fragments of a total happiness, which humanity is in. Now, the key question here then is what grants them what we call normative status, what makes them seem like that they are morally instructive. This is the way you should be. And here I want to say something, I anticipated this already and I'll come to it again at the end of the third lecture, which is that it seems to me what Adorno does throughout his work is something like phenomenological showing. Rather than argumentation or justification, he points to various kinds of experiences, little moments, and through a kind of showing, not just an aesthetic experience, but sometimes an aesthetic experience, he thinks he is showing us images of the right life, or moments of happiness. And I call these phenomenological models. They're not arguments, and they aren't incorrigible. They don't have the status of rational defensibility. I mean, someone could look at them and just say, well, I don't think that's the right life. Right? So they are highly uncertain. But Adorno thinks that's all we have. And he does think that, in a way, that's enough. I mean, this is the contrast between the magnum moralia that we associate with the pseudo-Aristotelian text and the minimum moralia of Adorno. But the minimum moralia does give you that. So that's the beginning of an answer. Okay.
So I have 5 questions, so the questions shouldn't be too long. The next would be very enough.
Thank you very much for your inspiring lecture. You talked about the normative standard in nature. And I have been wondering, what is exactly the source of this normativity? Is it nature as such, inner nature, tribes, or individuals? Or what is the unconscious as a deposit of the utopian, something like that? Or does reversals of the right head of life in the children's place really come from nature? So is it nature as such, or is it a specific attitude or stance toward nature that makes a difference?
Well, that's a very, very good question. So as I read him, I was trying to make a strong distinction between our regression back into nature, where we would lose all of the advantages and cognitive capacities that we've gained over the course of history. That would be just regression to nature, and remembrance of nature. So there's some way in which Adorno wants to say that we can sustain our status as enlightened creatures and yet still be, from within that enlightened status, responsive to the nature that most of us have otherwise repressed. So this is as if to say nature only becomes normative from the stance of our dissociation from nature. I think that's where it becomes normative. It has to be from that stance outside of it. It has to be from that position of responsiveness to it. Otherwise, you get a kind of irrationalist fusion, wouldn't you? I mean, you would get just kind of something like the celebration of like corporeal power, or kind of Nietzschean celebration of the natural, undistorted, powerful individual who doesn't obey any norms. So there's got to be that element of distance to give Adorno the dialectical tension between who we are now and the nature that most of us have lost. And it's that responsiveness that becomes normative. I know that doesn't sound terribly thick, but let me say that I'm trying to capture what it is that I think Adorno was saying. Whether we find it convincing, independent of Adorno's own arguments for it, is a separate kind of question. You know, this is because you might say there are two different ways of doing history philosophy, right? There's one where you're trying to reconstruct what you think the thinker thought, and then there's the kind of history of philosophy which most of us are more familiar with, where you're trying to reconstruct what the thinker thought and also defend what that thinker thought as the right thing to think. And most of us do the history of philosophy in the latter way, and here I have a much more modest goal, which is I'm trying to reconstruct what it is he thought. So.
Christoph Menke.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was very fascinating and powerful presentation. I have a question about, would like to ask you to say a little bit more about your understanding of immanence, like in immanent critique. So what does immanence here mean, and what is the structure of this immanence? Because at some point in your talk, I think for strategic reasons, you were using a whole series of, let's say, spatial metaphors to explain it. You said, find within the present, I mean, the negative or the utopian moment. Or you said, the present contains its own negation. And that could lead to, let's say, a misunderstanding, right? As if the present were a container, we have one kind of moments in that container and the opposite kind of moments. And that can somehow not be, right? So that immanence must somehow, as you also said, be split or fractured by a specific kind of difference. And what is the nature of that difference which is inscribed into immanence? I mean, the Fidelio scene was very, interesting about this, because in what sense could we say that the glimmer of light is immanent to the cell, because it comes from outside, right? Or in what sense is the angel as, or the wife of, Leonora, is she immanent to that world? Can we really say that? So there seems to be, the method of immanence, or containing, or within, or internal, seems not really to grasp the structural asymmetry between the way in which these opposing elements are present. So they are present in very different ways. And maybe can you say a little bit more about that?
Fascinating question, thank you. So first let me say that I've had trouble trying to decipher exactly what kind of contrast Adorno wants to motivate in the bourgeois opera essay when he describes that difference between two types of hope. Hope that shines from outside the prison, and the hope that shows up as light between the cell, between the bars in the prison wall. And you're right, it's an odd contrast. It sounds like a forced contrast because the light presumably is still coming from the sun beyond, even though it's showing itself between the bars. And that is perplexing, and yet that doesn't seem to be the contrast that Adorno wants to motivate. He seems to want to motivate something conceptual that perhaps the metaphors and the actual architecture of the prison doesn't really allow him to do, which is one of the tricky things. I love that passage, but it's a tricky problem in that passage that it maybe isn't fulfilling his own conceptual idea here. Because his conceptual idea seems to be that social reality has no outside. This is why it's wrong to make Adorno into a negative theologian, for example, or to read him as a Gnostic or any kind of other theological categories that we want to burden him with. He's not, because he doesn't think that social reality has an outside. He thinks that we have the social reality we're given. It's a mediated social reality, and it's formed historically, and it's transforming over time. But there is nothing but that social reality. It's true of artworks too, which, despite their relative autonomy, are of course responsive to, reflective of mediations of social power and so forth. So any potentials, any hope, any experiences that could somehow point beyond our current world have got to be ones that originate out of that social world. That's the concept that he seems to want to motivate, and the metaphor doesn't seem to be working terribly well for him. But it seems to me that with that concept, we can understand what he means by immanent critique. He wants to alert us to potentialities that are fleeting, that are quite weak, that are even damaged by or contaminated by the totality of distorted social relations. And yet those moments, those potentialities are of the sort that, as negativity, point to something beyond the immanent world. I fear I haven't done justice to the logic, the deeper logical puzzles that you're posing. But I'm going to keep thinking about them.
Thomas?
Thank you very much. I have a very basic question about how two of the points that you were making in your talk connect. I'm not sure exactly how you wanted to for those two things to be thought together. So you started by rejecting an overly negativistic understanding of Adorno's philosophy, and you were pointing out that we can't make any sense of it if we don't see the traces of an understanding of the possible good life. And from there on, you moved on to give us a certain account of what the structure of the normativity is that we find in Adorno. We're highlighting that we have to understand it in a materialist way and relate it back to our nature and something. And I wasn't sure how closely connected those two thoughts are. So whether the way you look at our nature and the way in which it is a source of normativity is related to the type of negativity you see at work in Adorno, or whether you thought it were two separate points. I mean, the reason to believe that there must be a connection is the fact that you started by quoting Feinhagen, who has this negativistic understanding, and he already has a certain understanding of what you call negative Aristotelianism. So there's a reference back to a certain type of nature that we can understand, that we can recognize, that we can see, and so on. So I was just wondering if you could say something with regard to the question how the two parts of the talk or the 2 points relate. So was this kind of account of a somehow naturalistic normativity that you find in Adorno an attempt of placing negativity differently in this kind of normativity? Or is this on your understanding just a separate point? That's just the right account of normativity for Adorno?
Great question. Okay, so the first thing to say about this is that I'm far more on board with Fabian's second point, that is his solution, which he calls negative Aristotelianism, than I am with the first point of the diagnosis. The epistemic negativism, or what he calls substantive negativism, basically that we're mired in the false so completely that we have no knowledge of the good, that the entirety of the social world is false, that we have no picture of happiness, no conception of alternatives. That strikes me as hyperbolic, and I think that's mistaken. His attempt to come up with an alternative, appealing somehow to Aristotelian potentiality, strikes me as a much more promising way to go, and I actually think it's incompatible with the hyperbolic diagnosis. So I think we should prize apart those two moments in his argument. Maybe this gets to why you thought those two moments were separate in my argument. I would prize them apart and I would say, well, no, he's not a theorist of total darkness, or he's not Mephistopheles, as I put it. Right? And it's because he's not that you can see him pointing to or showing in a kind of phenomenological way, though he wouldn't use those words, to little moments of experience that he thinks captures the kind of naturalistic happiness that is starting to vanish. Right? Now, I'm a little wary of using Aristotelian terminology to talk about that. Because first of all, I think it's more than negative Aristotelianism. It's more than just distorted experience. I mean, half of his collected oeuvre is about music. And in his writing about music, he's not constantly theorizing distortion. I'll get to this in the third lecture, but he really does think that aesthetic experience, perhaps most of all, is the site in which we can see the kind of happiness that most people are denied. But it's the kind of happiness that really is a model for us of the right life. So to call this negative strikes me as wrong altogether. This isn't just mere potentiality or potentiality that is only distorted. There's something much stronger there. The danger here, of course, is that I start to sound as if I'm painting Adorno as a kind of neo-romantic, a kind of late romantic. And I recognize that, but I think we need, when we read him, to actually be responsive to those moments in his work where he's trying to point to aesthetic experience, somatic experience, undistorted experience. And he really does cherish that kind of experience, and it becomes a site of great promise for him. Now, it may sound naive, it may sound romantic, but if we're trying to get in view a proper picture of what Adorno's philosophizing was like, shutting all of that down because it looks somehow unrespectable or kind of naive is not going to get us to a proper understanding of what he was like in his writing. So that's the beginning of an answer. I didn't respond to everything.
You have, in fact, only 1-2 minutes. Can you take one more question from me too? And then I have a small question. Which you don't have to answer today.
Thank you. I'll try to be very short. It's goes a little in the direction of Thomas Morales' question too. It's a question about one part of your reading of Reinhagen called next to Adorno. Because I had the impression that you were concentrating mainly on Reinhagen's idea of epistemic negativism, and I thought that in Reinhagen's book the meta-normative negativism is much more important, since I think his whole idea of somehow bringing Adorno back into the normative debates of today is trying to criticize what he calls the Begründungsprogramm of critical theory, right? So he tries to show that there is no need for a somehow positive normative source if you want to criticize present society's knowledge of the dead. And I think that is what he's meta-normative. And I would just like to ask you if you would criticize that position too, if you think this is a wrong conception of Adorno's thought, or if you think he's wrong.
Okay, great question. So I was concentrating on epistemic negativism because that's the claim that we can't know the good. But the epistemic negativism is parasitic upon or conditional upon what Reinhagen calls substantive negativism, which is the claim that the world is systematically distorted such that there is nothing good. There is nothing good on offer, and it follows that then with the epistemic claim that there would be nothing to know. Okay, so that's the substantive claim, you might say, is the deeper one. I didn't mention this because it seems to follow immediately that if we do know the good in some sense, then it is there. So I'm not bothering to challenge that. But let me just, as a very quick response to you, point out that if Adorno really were a substantive negativist in that sense, we wouldn't be able to make sense of all of his political interventions in post-war Germany. He spoke on the radio, he offered interventions in politics, he believed in the possibility of democratic education. Now, if he were a substantive negativist in the kind of strong sense, believing, as he once put it, that we live in an open-air prison, he really thought just that, then why political interventions at all? They're without any consequence. They would just be kind of, I don't know what they would be, kind of just rituals? I don't know. But I mean, one has to be able to make sense of those sorts of political interventions and those kinds of appeals to democratic improvement. I don't mean to turn Adorno into Edward Bernstein and say he's some kind of embarrassing reformist, but you know, Adorno in his practical politics had rather mild goals, right? So that's the beginning of an answer. There's a longer answer. I want to hear this one.
It's a short question, but I thought at the end the risk of the lecture was not so much romanticism, but positive Aristotelianism, something like that. I mean, you come up with the opposite of fine-hand solution. Because, I mean, when I ask myself what suffering means, in the way you try to understand it, it has nothing to do anymore with social suffering. It is suffering from being distracted or being dissociated from the organic potentialities of life. To have lost contact with the organic potentiality. And all the references to the minima moralia we were giving are indicating exactly that. So that one could say, when you refer to materialism, you are not referring, as you said by yourself, neither to materialism, to Marxist materialism, not to the materialism of the 19th century, which was awkwardly mechanistic, but you are referring back to a kind of Aristotelianism. That's the alternative we have to the materialism of Marx and the mechanic understanding of nature in the 19th century. So how do we avoid that? There is a certain requirement to make use of an Aristotelian understanding.
Do I have to answer this now?
No. No, as I said, we are very late, you are very tired.
They're tired, I'm not. I'll just say one thing, and then everybody can go home. I do think it's the case that much of the social suffering that Adorno identified appeared for him as through certain quasi-naturalistic effects. I mean, in other words, he often thinks of one of the major social pathologies of modern capitalism is that it's dissociated us from one another, from our own bodies. It's produced libidinal distortions. It's produced transactional distortions. It's produced a whole lot of distortions that have a natural dimension to them, and that's very interesting. I mean, the line in negative dialectics is "Ve sagt ge," right? Woe says go. This is this strange appeal to natural suffering, as if natural suffering is the ultimate protest against a social world that's made us suffer in a whole variety of ways. And I think it's just the case that with all of his sociological acumen, Adorno was not primarily a political theorist. And he refers back a great deal of his sociological analysis back to the experiential dimension. And that's why I think that, that final quote from The Authoritarian Personality is so interesting. Because there you have Adorno using the psychological techniques that he had developed with his American colleagues and saying, look at individuals who have the wrong sort of politics. Individuals who have the wrong sort of politics don't just have the wrong sort of politics. They have the wrong relationship to themselves. And that's an interesting indication of the way that there's something distorted on the level of nature that Adorno finds in a way far more troubling or of greater instruction for him somehow than any kind of picture in politics or economics.
I'm sorry to everyone who couldn't raise his or her question. Maybe tomorrow. So thank you very much.